Hello, everybody. Welcome. For those of you who we haven't met, welcome to Data and Society and to the public panel for our workshop of the same name, Connective Tissues, Stories of Digitality, Infrastructures, and Resistance. My name is Maia Woluchem. I use she, her pronouns. I am the program director of the Trustworthy Infrastructures team here at Data and Society. I'm so excited to be your host today with support from my colleagues, Tunika Onekikame and Ireti Akinrenade from our engagement team. For those joining a Data and Society event for the first time, Data and Society is an independent research institute studying the social implications of data, AI, and automation. We produce original research and regularly convene multidisciplinary thinkers to challenge the power and the purpose of technology in society. You can learn more about who we are and where we're headed on our website, dataandsociety.net. So for the next hour, we're going to be spending some time getting ourselves grounded in today's conversation around infrastructure and around storytelling and the urgency of these ideas at this time. But I want to start by grounding us in why these ideas and why now. On the Trustworthy Infrastructures team, we have been really concerned and really interested in this idea of speculative fiction and myth making, particularly as it relates to these ideas of progress, transformation, and the future. We're really interested in what these myths do to justify both some of our best and also some of our most harmful global investments in nefarious infrastructures of all types, social, digital, ecological, technological, and especially now. So one question for us, is it the myths and the stories that we tell about progress that create the conditions for infrastructures to be built? And if so, how does that work? And how can we reclaim this idea of this kind of myth making for ourselves and for our communities? So we take this argument very seriously that storytelling is an incredible tool, not just for crafting harmful speculation, but also beautiful, important, liberatory ones. So we're going to ask this question today of what these ideas can do for, with, and by the communities that we're all a part of. Storytelling, of course, can help us create an archive that outlasts us. It can also broaden our epistemological tools. It can help us organize, research, engage with folks in meaningful ways. And so today's discussion is going to take on these critical questions of material and digital infrastructures through many different lenses with three luminaries who take very different methodological approaches to both infrastructure and to this idea of storytelling and myth making. We're building towards a conversation that takes on these tensions that infrastructures foster around the world and the way that they intertwine with these ideas of progress, transformation, and speculation. So enough for me. I'm happy to introduce our incredible speakers here today. Right in this box close by me is Nia Johnson, whose scholarship lies at the intersection of health law, bioethics, race, and the law. Her work studies discrimination in healthcare delivery, public health infrastructure development, and political forces that disrupt public health initiatives. We also have Ekene Ijeoma, an interdisciplinary artist who researches the impact of unjust systems and develops artworks that poetically expose inequity or engage people in collaboratively changing society. His data-driven and interactive multimedia works include a series of performances in which notes are removed from the Star-Spangled Banner at the increasing rate of incarceration in the US, and a light installation that invites participants to synchronize their breathing with his as well. Lori Regattieri is a public interest technologist working for a just energy transition and territorial rights. As a consultant in the philanthropic and nonprofit sector, they work to catalyze collaboration and build South-South coalitions to address the intersection of climate justice and emerging technologies. We're so happy to have the three of you here in this room with me today. Thank you so much for coming along. And I want to just start with a sort of brief grounding question for us to kind of kickstart our conversation today. So we're here talking about infrastructure, and I'm just curious how you all would describe your approach to thinking about infrastructure. We know it can be material, it can be subjective, social, technological, and the three of you take very many perspectives on what it means or whether it actually means anything at all. So I wonder if from your perspective, you can sort of talk through that term, what it means to your work, and how you conceptualize it in your practice. And maybe just to softball it, Nia, I'm happy to pass it to you if you'd like to start us out.
Sure, I'd be happy to start us off. Again, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. So when people ask me about infrastructure and how it's informed by the work that I do, what I try to let them know is that I'm really interested in the way that politics build up or tear down infrastructure. I never thought that this would be as on topic as it is right now. But that's really the core of my work, which means that sometimes my methods don't necessarily look at the path to the greatest ethical forms of liberation. That's something that, I think is important. And there are many, many talented scholars and activists and artists who are doing that work. But what I'm really interested in are the nuts and bolts that bring us to better health infrastructure. So I'm thinking about things like political messaging, right? Like thinking about what resonates with people. I'm thinking about what information overload looks like to people, right? If you ask people to respond to too many questions at once, does that make them disdain your policy? And I'm also starting to do a little bit of work myself about, social media accountability, right? Like we have this budding field of influencing, which, I think has kind of developed under all of our noses. But I'm also very interested in thinking about, what is the responsibility of influencers? Like if they want to be purveyors of information and culture, then are they responsible? Are they claiming responsibility depending on the space that they're in? And at the end of the day, for me, all of those roads lead back to health equity, right? Like the internet is where we get most of our information about health. I think for myself as a person of color, a Black woman specifically, Black folks have had the ability to pass on information about health through a variety of channels that, have relied on oral tradition and storytelling and sharing. And what I try to do is document that, but also take into account some of the other quantitative methods of understanding health disparities and health equity in the US.
Beautiful and so rich. It could not be sort of a more timely question for us here in the US, and certainly connecting to so much of the work that so many of our other participants and certainly our panelists are thinking about as well. Lori, I'd love to bring you in on this question of what infrastructure means to your practice, to your work, how you think about it as you're doing your work in your communities.
Well, first of all, thanks for everybody that came. I know Olá do Brasil, many people from Brazil excited for this call. So thanks for the solidarity around. Well, I look at the infrastructures from a very early age. I grew up in a city that was the key way out for the mining companies. So I grew up very close to a port. So I started to look as kind of like as a cultural artifact. It was there, we could see, but we didn't know much about it. So for me, it started from much young age because they used to take us for the sport and teach us how amazing it was and how this would bring us jobs and development. Nothing of these promises happened. So I started to look at the infrastructures as cultural artifacts in time, in place, in our communities, in our vegetation, invading our worlds. So from there, I started to look at, obviously, from a lot of time has passed. So I started to understand better the complexities that comes from the material architecture that are composing these systems and the logistics of power that are integrating financial, political, and also the resistance from the communities that I'm part of, and I think we are all part of. So I started to look at infrastructure as a history tale. I mean, as logistics has been changing, as we're looking into the financial systems, pushing for governance and for more control. At the same time, what we are seeing is that, for example, supply chain security actually needs a lot of smooth circulation of goods. But the people, what we know so far, did not, they're not seen as equal. So something that for me takes a lot as I work with environmental justice is what kind of mediation is infrastructure doing in our, particularly in our beyonds. When I go to Amazonia, when I go to the Cerrado, when I go to the semiárido, when I go to the Caatinga, I grew up in Mata Atlântica, which is unfortunately was almost devastated completely. So that's how I look at infrastructure. It's mediating history and it's mediating the relationships with time and finance and with history itself.
I think it's so compelling, this idea that these infrastructures are sort of layered on top of each other, that there are the communities in which this infrastructure is living. It's also the interactions between so many systems, some of which liberatory, others oppressive. I think it's just a really, really rich example. Ekene, I'd love to bring you into this. Um, what does infrastructure mean to your work? If it means anything at all?
Yeah, I think the mention of looking at infrastructure as cultural artifacts is a good transition into the work that I'm doing. Um, I mean, yeah, I think about infrastructures adjacent to systems, and when I'm thinking about systems, I'm thinking about how they're um, affecting people in a way that's equitable or justified or not. And thinking about how I can use that as a medium in my work. I have many works in which I use data or systems as cultural artifacts, as symbols, and then I'll then again use data to sort of manipulate that or to um, just add another layer of meaning on top of it to change people's perspectives on that. From another side in my work, I'm also, as far as using the systems as mediums, then I start to think about infrastructure that's needed to produce some of the work that I'm doing, which is thinking about how we can scale art to that of injustice or inequity, which is at the level of a system. So, for example, in ongoing work that I'm doing now, Black Forest, we're thinking about how, well, it started from thinking about how we can address COVID-19 at the scale that it was, not just global, but thinking within the US, it was national and it was across all 50 states, and thinking about how we can create a living monument and archive for lives lost, specifically Black lives, because at the time they were disproportionately affected. And thinking about, well, should that be at the National Mall or should it be across the nation? And how do you work at the scale of something is to work at the scale of a system. And you can either use existing systems or you can create your own. With this project to start planting trees as monuments for Black Lives Lost, it was to use the infrastructure of urban forestry that's already existing. All this work is being done, but then taking that, using it as a medium to then rethink what it means to plant a tree.
I think this is such an important. Oh no, that's on my end. I think this is such an important idea here, kind of what we're doing to build up our own sort of monuments, our own ability to be able to tell these histories and tell these tales. Very timely because we are coming off the end of our connective tissues workshop that we spent, all day today thinking about this role of storytelling, speculation, myth making, and really what these tools do in our hands. And I've heard so much even in just this early piece here about what are kind of artifacts of history? What are we doing to sort of mediate, the ambient conditions that we're all sort of walking through? And so I wonder if you all can talk a little bit about this idea of speculation, whether it's storytelling, whether it's, you know, metabolizing history through our own tools, our own words. What has that meant in your work? Is it helping us? Is it hurting us? How do we consider using these tools? And really, what's the importance of that moving forward? And I will pass it to anybody who wants to jump in on this question of speculation, storytelling, myth making, history making, however we consider it.
So I'm happy to go ahead and jump in. So it's interesting. When I first started doing this work, storytelling was like a really core part of what I did. It was really about surfacing stories about healthcare systems and the way that Black Americans specifically experience healthcare systems, and how that was a huge part of my work, and it still is in some ways. But I've realized as I've grown, not even grown as a scholar, but as times have changed, and I am doing my best to, ask questions that matter for the time and not just for what I want to do. I've realized that we're in a moment where there's actually an oversaturation of stories in some breaths, and then also no stories at all in other breaths. And that I think has been both helpful and harmful, right? Like we've gone through this cultural moment of really caring, for example, about representation, and kind of like this recasting of, ideas about like, well, we want to feel seen in the media, we want to feel seen in politics. And I would argue that I think we've actually transitioned into a bit of performativeness in that space where people are like, fine, like let's just put, whatever type of X programming on television, let's put X people in political ads, like let's do whatever it takes so that we appear to be with the times and we appear to be equity centered. I think there are a lot of tech companies that use that model as well, but it also does two things. I think one, it ignores the representation that already existed that maybe people weren't necessarily looking for. Like when people think about representation, for example, for Black children, we conveniently forget that there were many different institutions, whether that was like the Dear America series, American Girl, like, even Deborah Gregory, like, just using some pop culture references where there was representation and positive representation of Black folks. So that has, essentially been erased from the storytelling of this moment. But then it also ignores the animosity towards those institutions as well. And though I think the animosity is not justified and it is unjust and it is unfair, excuse me, it is there, right? And, something that I tell my students all the time is that democracy is a group project, right? And so even when things are unfair, you are in community with others, whether you agree with them or not. And so that desire to feel represented, and I think, I would almost argue maybe to feel more akin to whiteness than we normally get the chance to be. We ignored not only that you can never quite be white, but we've also ignored that there was a burgeoning displeasure that has evolved into a culture war that actually has very high costs. And so a lot of my work now has started to query, like, what are these stories for? And also, like, what do these stories mean when we monetize them, right? Like, what are the false narratives that we spin, even those of us who will probably consider ourselves to be in liberal alignments? How do we spin stories that may just be benefiting us and not necessarily benefiting the community at large? And thinking about those things critically.
I heard a few things. Like, who are these stories for? What the purpose is? What does it mean if we're telling them? Who is supposed to be telling them in the first place? I think it's so interesting. And I know this has been reflected both in Lori, your work, Ekene, and your work as well. I'm curious if you can help us imagine what this idea of storytelling speculation, however you might consider it, shows up in your work.
I had a few examples that I took, but I just got a message from a great friend that he was just leaving his work at the outskirts of Rio de Janeiro. He might be on the bus right now listening to our conversation. So I just got to, maybe this is a great example. Well, Paulinho, that he works with citizen generate data. Because, for example, when you think about the official data, a good example now for Brazil is that it took 150 years for the census to count the quilombolas in Brazil. The quilombolas are the Afro-descendants that for years and years have settled and built on autonomy. But only in 2022, we had a census. So something that we are thriving on storytelling is take the official data, but also the first one, but also the stories that were out there, but they were not being told. So one of the projects that we are working is this archival, this cartography that is not just coming up on the official data that it's very important. Statistics. So I think we are speculating also with the methodology that obviously is very important. I know the US is probably facing challenge when it comes to this. But when you bring the community, so you have this storytelling that comes with this provocation that now we have this data, but what was happening when we are talking about, for example, maybe years that the different ways that the community was living and the study was not there officially. What were the kind of policies for health? The COVID was also a moment in which communities started to do their citizen-generated data themselves in different parts of Brazil because of connectivity, the digital divide. And then again, we come to the infrastructure issues. I want to give this as such a good example because it's inspiring a connection between the urban Black initiatives with the initiatives from this rural Black and settlement communities coming together to tell the many stories that exist. And it's an ongoing project that is going out. And I just want to bring this as probably my friend is hearing, and it's someone that it's been leveraging up, and we are having this great opportunity to work together.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I was thinking, as you two have been speaking about, well, starting with representation and the idea of overrepresentation and the saturation of images, because that's where I became interested in using data. Because with all the images, especially images that are used to represent, um, violence against oppressed people, I thought that we were becoming oversaturated with those images. I mean, and that has been for a while now. And I wanted to see what was outside of the frames of those images. And that's when I started looking at data as a way to look outside, and thinking about, as an artist, not painting with material, um, and how I can paint with a different type of digital material, which is, pixels, and how much meaning each pixel is a data point, and how much meaning uh, can be sort of both captured and also expressed through that. I mean, each data point is also a lived experience. And, with the way things are represented, sometimes you just see that a few people are being affected, and we like to focus on one or two people because maybe that's what people can understand. But then I wanted to see how to do that at the scale that it was happening. And actually, that's bring me away from sort of figurative representation, into more of a poetic um, representation of these ideas, and just going back to, infrastructure and systems as cultural artifacts, and how they become cultural artifacts is being in conversation with people and their lived experience. And yeah, I think if the work can become part of that, it has to live through them. And I think that's what the stories are, and how they continue on. Oh, the other thing is, yeah, Nia said something about the stories seeming the same or feeling the same. And that's also how I was feeling too, because I feel like we hear the same stories over and over and over again. And that's also how I became interested in art, because I wanted to find new ways of saying the same thing that's been said.
Yeah. And I just want to add on to Kene's point, and Lori's point, because I think a theme that is kind of being pulled between all three of us is that, you know, information and images are in stories, actually more specifically, are tied to timing, right? Like I was teaching this morning and I was telling my students that, we are about 13 years from, the kind of the origins of the Black Lives Matter movement, with the death of Trayvon Martin, right? Like that's a long time. That means that you have a lot of time to evaluate, like, what do people know? What don't people know? For myself, as somebody who studies health politics, right? Like, what can people absorb? absorb, what can't people absorb, what messages do people like, what messages don't like. And as often as things are changing, many things are the same. And so you have to determine what you're dealing with. So like, for example, we can think about, we all get online and we get on our phones. We think about the types of stories we may see that pertain to a certain element of, let's say, like American Black culture. So you talk about like microaggressions, you may see like structural racism, you may see folks like, during the COVID time, folks who are disproportionately impacted by COVID, less representation in doctors. And you see these stories over and over and over again. And it's interesting because for a portion of the country, those are comforting narratives, right? Because it shows that you have community amongst people who are struggling with the same things that you're struggling with. What we did not take into account is that there were other folks who were reading and watching those narratives as well and started to feel threatened, right? And started to feel like they were potentially being displaced. And again, this isn't really about whether that is right or wrong, at least for the purposes of this conversation. But it is worth acknowledging that, again, because we have chosen, and I think there's work to be done to make sure we don't live this way for forever, but because we have chosen in this country culturally to believe that everything is a zero-sum game and that there's not opportunities for people to win collaboratively. And if we knew that about the culture, right, if those are also some of the stories that we told, we probably would have been a little bit more vigilant and less surprised by the political state of the country right now. I think many people are getting more than what they bargained for. But again, there was a bit of, a fiction created about like, what is this country really capable of? Where are they? And because, I think some people had ideas, or rather not ideas, I think people had stories that they thought had actually developed roots. And what actually happened in this country is that we learned that there were no roots, right? It was just performative. It was just to not be quote unquote canceled. We learned that, some of these goals and dreams were indeed just stories. And maybe we didn't actually use the timing of the things that we were bringing forward, the movement and taking into account the speed of information as well as we could have.
So two things I want to reflect upon that. One is that I want to pause for the audience to note if you have any questions for our panelists here, please do put them either in the chat or in the Q&A box. But I'm going to go a little bit off script for a moment because I feel like I've heard in so many ways this kind of implications about power, like what power means, how people are navigating it, how they're building it, whether we need to, whether our stories or our conditions matter, if we're considering or not considering power. And so I just am curious if there's meaning to that for you. Like, how would we think about power in this time? How should we think about it in relationship to our work? How should we think about it in relationship to the stories that we're telling, the stories that we choose to do, to focus on, the ways that we're building infrastructure? Like, are we doing it because we love it? Are we doing it because there's some kind of argument here about power that's sort of implicit in what we're talking about and what we're working on?
I guess I'll go again. I don't want to take over the panel. Yeah, no, I mean, in my work, this is something I'm thinking about all the time. And I'm also thinking about how fluid power can be as well, right? Like understanding intersections of privilege. Like you can be, as many of us on this call already know, that you can be privileged in one area and then like not privileged in another, and also how that aligns with power can shift. And so I think actually what's most important when we think about power is also knowing how to read a moment as well, right? And opening yourself to strategy. I think there are a lot of folks who are suspicious of strategy because they see it aligned with power, right? Like, oh, the people who are strategizing are trying to, push people out of discourse. And that's not necessarily true, right? Like strategy exists for a reason, right? There's a reason why, like all of us do what we do. And maybe we don't necessarily work with like social security reform, right? Because that's complicated. And there are people who are good at this, who use strategy and navigate certain things. And we are happy to turn that over to them. But I think, power can show up in other ways too. And I think even those of us who are marginalized or studying marginalized groups and are thinking about marginalized groups have to think about, okay, but what is my intersection with power too, right? Like even when we look at what we see online, like we've seen basically like the sharing economy start to transition into the individualistic economy, right? Where there are folks, for example, who make money in their livelihoods off of sharing political events online or sharing social justice events online. I can imagine that the women who started Black Lives Matter did not intend for that to be the case, right? But now, 13 years later, we're now at the monetization of social justice, right? And the monetization of movements. And so we do need to recognize that as a sort of power, and it's not inherently good power. Right? Like we have to decide whether that's good or bad power. And so I think that's actually even more important than ever as we try to understand, the infrastructure specifically in the US that's kind of crumbling around us. We need to be prepared to have hard conversations with ourselves about why it's happening, and how we may have inadvertently contributed to the infrastructure crumbling around us, whether it's right or wrong.
Maybe I can.
But when I hear you talk about the monetization of that, I think about, well, the lack of infrastructure to support organizers and cultural workers. And, I don't know if it's on them or the current system, you know.
I mean, I think it's on both, we pay for what we support, right? Like, when you focus all your resources on STEM and you don't necessarily focus it on the humanities, you lose conversation about humanity, right? And also, like, people get paid to do things every day, like a range of activities. And so I don't think it's necessarily their fault per se, but I do think it's a new way of understanding power, right? Like before, political discourse, and not that this is always about political discourse, but I think it's fitting. Political discourse for a long time was regulated to like, two different groups of people, and very small groups of people. That's why the bully pulpit was called the bully pulpit. It was the idea that the president had the airwaves on any program. Well, now that you've given people phones, that the bully pulpit doesn't mean what it used to mean. Like political commentary has become democratized. People are looking to different sources for information, and that's okay. But also, that also becomes an accumulation of power as well that then informs the political stances in the world. And then you also may have to bring in a conversation about expertise to that as well to even know what you were reading, what are you consuming, how are you shifting discourse? Because I would imagine that, even if we think about like the current political moment that we're in, lest we forget that during 2020, people just asked for police brutality to be ended. They didn't ask for like massive DEI opportunities, right? So there's a backlash against the thing that wasn't even asked for, right? That now has galvanized like a completely different political ideology. So you're right. Like we don't fund these institutions as we should, and I think there are reasons both like honest and nefarious, mostly nefarious, about why we don't. But I do think it's also worth acknowledging that there's a transfer of power in people's voices now that haven't always existed. And that fundamentally changes the landscape of infrastructure and like what are we building towards? If everybody's voice is equally as important, and not like obviously political voice and like, humanistic voice, but if everybody's voice is equally as important because they hold a phone, then where do you actually figure out what infrastructure is worth building? Because everybody has a different opinion about what it should look like.
I just want to add a bit because lately we have been hearing a lot about participatory, especially in the AI, right? And I really like my former colleague, for example, Abeba Behain, that always has a very strategic, I think, framing on how it can be there's a lot of capture when there is a participatory framing that is not grounded in compositions of the layers between the community, what kind of policies what we are talking about, and what Nia, I think you working on this sort of like, I think the storytelling and the images produced. Because when I see, for example, our history here in Brazil of social movements, the landless movement, movements that for quite some time they had, a picture from the mainstream kind of circulation, a lot of negativity and kind of, sort of like when we had this sort of, I guess, mass communication about the struggles for land. But then what I realized is that the speculation with this, the participatory convocation for people to participate, to be part of it, to get to know a movement, is something that I think what I see is that in the middle of the cultural artifacts that are in the mediation of the shared struggles of the many movements, I keep thinking that there is something to be reclaimed from speculation and not give to opacity. So because then you have opacity, people claim, oh, this is a participatory process, it's redistributive of power, but then it's not, So I guess building off what you're saying, Mia, it's really important to have to be participatory, anything to be very well taken care of, right?
Yeah. And also to, going back to what Maya so graciously said earlier about like, who are these stories for? Right. I think what and all of us are experiencing like the information age as it's happening, right? Like we're waking up, rolling over, looking at our phones. Like we are living it. And I think we're all learning about what that means. For me, I'm thinking about that in the context of like health and politics and how information is diffused. But I love this question of like, who are these stories actually for? Like going back to questions of representation. To some extent, representation is for the people, right? Like, like telling stories in certain ways is for the people who felt like their stories weren't told accurately. I think, though, it's worth querying, but is that for everybody else, right? And so before we ended up in the information age, you could control that a little bit differently. So, like, for example, I grew up in Maryland, and I remember that we used to have this children's bookstore called Caribou Books. And it only sold just like Afrocentric books, specifically for children, and like like the occasional mask in there, like a little bit of kente cloth. Like it was very much so that type of space. But that, in a way, is how you control not only like what goes into a story, but who comes out from the story as well. So this was built for people who wanted to feel represented in a particular way. And so they opted into the space. And I think we think that algorithms kind of function the way that brick and mortar does, that there's an opting in. But we forget that algorithms aren't necessarily like doors, right? Like they're free flowing. They're really more like, like sieves, fences, cheesecloths, like anything that lets materials both in and out. And so that means that the stories that were meant to elevate a particular group of people are now being diffused like into a much broader landscape. And even going back to Ekene's points about, how do we fund social movements? I think it's also upon the social movement, especially now, to think about what does that diffusion mean when it goes out. And I recognize, that's like something that many people would critique because folks have hoped that they would not have to respond to the information going out, right? Like we should not be responsible for how other people see us. And I don't think I'm there either. Like, I don't think that's what is required. But I do think, again, if you reap the consequences of something, it's worth at least knowing what it was and at least knowing what it is. That doesn't mean that you should stop. It just means that you should be fully aware and opt into both of those systems. So I think all of you are absolutely right.
Ekene, I know that you've in your work have really engaged with this idea of what art as a practice can do to really engage with these concepts of power. And I wonder if you have something to add to, pile on.
Um, I I don't know if I can speak to power on a sort of I guess it sounds like we're talking about power in a sort of logistical way, but when I'm, organizing to plant trees with communities, that feels like a lot of power that is outside of that. We can't actually see the immediate impacts or immediate benefits, but they're all there. And I think there's a power in, I guess what it's doing is also helping people imagine the possibilities of a better future. And there's power in that. So I guess I just want to uplift maybe soft power.
I love that. Very meaningful to me, Kenny. Thank you so much. So we have actually quite a few questions in the chat, and I am going to raise a few. Um, okay, maybe we'll start with Noella's question. I think this is a really interesting one. So Noella came first. Noella is saying these wonderful speakers have talked about new ways of telling the same thing and telling stories that reveal how we win collaboratively. So the question here is, how can we show people through stories that winning can happen collaboratively and that we aren't necessarily living in a zero-sum game? What is a story that you've seen, heard, told that illustrates a winning collaborative practice? I think there's some shades that we've touched on in this earlier conversation, but I think it's a really interesting way of posing this question.
So I think to answer the question of, how do we go about doing that? And this is something I'm actually practicing in my own life and encouraging with my students, is really being open to hearing both sides of a story. Even if you think of a side of a story as unmerited or I think in extreme cases unjust. I'm a lawyer by training. And so a lot of the work that I do and I was trained to do was to evaluate all of the facts, right? And not just the facts that feel good to me. I think some of the pros and cons of algorithms and the type of content we consume is that we only have to consume what we like. You don't have to consume all of the facts. You don't have to, consume every point of view. But I feel like when you do, it actually can be very productive. And, some of the ways that I've seen this, and, I won't be too specific to preserve privacy, but I see this a lot with my students. So it's really important to me, for example, that my students have opportunities to journal in the class, but they only turn their journals into me. And so I remind them that they're free to disagree and they're allowed to talk about their backgrounds and they're allowed to talk about, the perspectives in their communities and their growth and their trajectories. And the reason why that's so important is because nowadays, quite frankly, if you say the wrong thing and you step out of line, you can lose a lot of your social prowess. You can lose opportunities, you can lose jobs, like you can lose all sorts of things. And so we've really taught a generation of people how to fake really well. And as somebody who grew up in Judeo-Christian religious spaces, I know it when I see it, right? Like people have learned how to perform over and over and over again. But I've also learned from being in those spaces that if people don't tell the truth, you don't actually make progress. And the only way that you can really get people to tell the truth is if you sit and listen to them. I do my best, and it's hard some days, to listen to people who I don't politically align with. I try to see things through their eyes and to see, how they came to certain conclusions. Some of that is information that we may categorize as misinformation, for example, but some of this is also just like general frustrations. And to get to the point of how do we help people see that this is not a sum game. I think work like The Sum of Us is a really good example, reminds us that, many of the frustrations that we see right now in the American legal landscapes are indicators of infrastructure failures and policy failures. There were things that lawmakers were supposed to do that they fundamentally did not do. We can look at the coal industry, for example. Yes, you can decide from a public health standpoint or empirically, say it's correct that from a public health standpoint, working with coal is dangerous and it creates all these, health implications and tax dollars and what have you. Okay, fine, but you still have the responsibility to put people in jobs, right? Like you have the responsibility to build up communities. Now, if you were open to studying the history of predominantly Black and Brown neighborhoods, you would know that this is something that happens to Black and Brown neighborhoods all the time, where they are systemically oppressed by not taking away infrastructure and not building it back up, right? So if you paid attention to those stories, you would have seen what was happening to your community already on the horizon, because who is considered like less than shifts over time, power shifts over time. And so reminding people of those stories and allowing for them to be participants and believing that they can actually be better people, believing that they can actually be a part of stories of equity and not just looking to jump down their throats and demanding that they are with you 100%, I think is one of the most important ways that we can get there, especially now.
I can mention something that I have been practicing is working with different professionals and background and activists and their different backgrounds. And since I'm always in this intersection of data, emerging technologies, and particularly the land struggles that comes from the climate agenda, but the land struggles attached, and more broadly, the cultural practices that we see and the experiences they create. So what I realized most recently, for example, when I'm developing those workshops on climate disinformation with communities, particularly, what comes up a lot is the different methods that comes not from the Western, maybe the most knowledgeable that we have in our package, Western science, let's say, but also the kinds of stories that are coming from orality to combat disinformation. So a community, for example, we tried this exercise that, for example, can use humanitarian OpenStreetMap, for example, open source tools with the official data, but also interviews. Let's interview your grandmother, because if there's people saying some weird stuff about climate change, but what if we interview also someone that has been in the territory for a long time, and it also has seen the different shapes that the vegetation is taking, the way that the rain comes and how it takes more time to come. And then we start collecting other sources of data. We can also use now different ways we now have this new technology that's called LIDAR, lightning identification and ranging, that brings another layer of histories because of the archaeologists working with indigenous archaeologists. So, when you bring collective intelligence and the level of access that we can have now, connecting with transnational solidarity, listen to Ekene, Nia here, for example, I'm now full of ideas to go back to the territory and talk more and engage more. So, and then this toolkit that we have continues to change and to adapt, because we go to another workshop. Again, it's the question just say that it's not the same. The problems are not the same. And specifically, I think Ekene put the key of logistics. When you're talking about the power and, so you can identify the different layers and levels in which logistics is bringing new problems, new issues, and the solutions that can come from this. And so that's why the toolkit is always in adaptation. There is this resilience effect that comes from the intelligence of the community.
Nia, would you like to jump in on this one? Otherwise, I have a question I think we'll go in the other direction this time. You ready? Okay. So we have one that's really popping off here in this chat. And thank you, audience members, for upvoting these. I think this is really interesting on this use of AI. And we talked about it actually in our earlier conversations about what is the sort of noisiness of the online community? What's the usefulness of an image? Like, how do we think about these artifacts that we're creating in our work and where they're landing? So Sally is asking this question. Speaking of not being grounded and AI, what is everyone thinking about the implications of the rapid disruption of generative AI in everyday discourse, infrastructure, and arbitrated history, and the online community? How might we better attend to and elevate the stories that need to be heard and told in a swamp of AI hallucinations and content? And Ekene, I'm going to ask that you go first if you feel comfortable jumping in here.
Me personally, I haven't been looking at a lot of AI images as far as I know, but you never know these days. But yeah, I think as you know, for me, AI is interesting as an artist because, especially as a conceptual artist, because I'm not based in any style or aesthetic. And so I think it'll be really difficult for people who AI can, generate work in the same aesthetic as or same style as they can. But I think more conceptual practice is more a way of thinking and relating. And I'm sure AI can do that too, but I feel like that's not what people are actually focusing on, because that's not what makes money. Yeah, there's not images like I mean, you know, a toilet sells only if an artist gives value to it. I don't know if an AI can be like, this toilet is art now, and sell that for a lot of money. I just don't know when that's gonna happen. So yeah, as someone that doesn't produce like image based work, I'm not so concerned about it. Um, Also, I mean, yeah, figurative is work is like, feels like it's, yeah, the majority of work being produced now. It seems, at least that's what's being highlighted. But yeah, when I think, I mean, I use it as a tool. I just started using it for a very specific project in which I needed to create perspectives of people that don't exist in photographs. And and I was actually surprised that, yeah, when you put in some like, uh, if I were to tell it to generate, and we did this across many different services, but if I were to ask it to generate an image of Martin Luther King, we would actually get representations that are have white skin, not just white skin, but also him with like white features but a darker face. And it's just, wow, it's so surprising. Even with Malcolm X, we got white representations of Malcolm X. Yeah, it's just so interesting. I mean, if someone didn't know what he looked like, for a lot of people, this is what they go to before Google. They just, maybe go to ChatGPT and ask it, hey, what did MLK look like? And it generates this thing. Yeah, it's as if it's not even referencing historical images. Oh, and the film representations of these characters overweigh the actual historical representations of them. So instead of getting actual images that are being generated based on historical photographs of these Black figures, they're using the representation in films, because I guess those are the images that are in higher circulation. So, I mean, I think it has a lot of interesting issues.
I just want to add, and actually kind of fold in another question that somebody asked about, like, does where you're from inform, the stories that you think are valuable? And, I will definitely own and say yes. Like, I grew up as a museum kid, because growing up in the DC area, museums are free. So I spent a lot of time engaging with art, not as an artist, like I didn't have that level of ability, but just to like be somebody who could absorb art and messaging through culture. And I think it really did shape my perspectives. But I also think that it can tell us a really important lesson about what is important, and I guess like how to use AI appropriately. I don't know if I'm ready to say like, and we should be combating AI, like not necessarily. But I do think that there's a way to like not be a Luddite, but also be mindful of how far these things can go. And I think full circle back to the theme of this program is to actually tell stories, right? Not just, like depend on a computer to tell you stories, but really like think about what you are experiencing and reach back to the elders in your community, your parents, your loved ones, your friends, and actually ask them real stories. And I also think, as much as there is like a lot of hoopla about not HI, hoopla about AI, and now people are very nervous and concerned about, like we said, like we're getting these false representations of folks and what have you. I do think that there still are folks who are craving something real as well, right? Like, we're starting to see articles, for example, that about like, why is everybody dressed the same, right? Like some of that is due, well, not some, a lot of it is due to algorithms, and people are tired. They're going online and saying that they're uninspired, right? And, from time to time, I'll tell folks like, grass is outside. You can choose to go out and touch grass. Like in your context, that's not a revolutionary act, right? Like you're allowed to do that. And so I think it's important that to counter AI, we have to still engage with what's real, because people are thirsty for it. And I don't say that from a place of narcissism where it's like, I've seen a lot of interview people like, well, AI just can't replicate the human touch. It may at some point, or if your bar for the human touch diminishes over time, AI really may fill that void. But I think if you want to preserve truth and actual stories, some of that just comes through living out real experiences. And then just quickly, I'll add, and then also holding, some of these institutions accountable, right? Like there's a reason why Google works really hard to say like this is an accurate image and probably will continue to do so. There are reasons why other institutions are not invested in saying that, and much of that comes back to profit. And so it's important to recognize that in the beginning so that we kind of know what AI to look for.
Yeah, I think I last year, that's I think maybe a couple years ago, maybe 2 years ago. I think was when I met. I say like this, but it wasn't when I met Sylvia Winter through. It was a book, an amazing book by the demons. There's something about demons too. It was a very great scholar from US, and then I started to think about the question, what it means to be human. She puts consistently and provokes us of this biocentric principles that are in the core of AI. So, I mean, obviously not, she's not talking about that, but when we go into these discussions of generative, but generative of what? Uh, once you break down the biocentric and Western push to suppress the subjectivity, to suppress what is most beautiful about invention, that is, it's unpredictable, right? And so that's what I keep thinking about it. And I think that's what worries me the most when you think about collective intelligence. Because if, AI, but as we are seeing now, is producing, I don't even think about in terms of bias, but it's actually the violence and also the erase of a future that might exist, but does not exist because those images are retained and the stories as well. So I keep thinking of how Sylvia Winter might be this goddess that might be guiding our hearts to a better sense of place and being in community and building infrastructures.
Oh my goodness. I feel like we could do this for another several hours. I could at least, I don't know. We have so many questions in the audience still left over for you three. Well, we only have 3 minutes left. So I am going to lob what I hope will not be the final question because I hope that we get to do this again sometime soon. But in thinking about this idea of truth, maybe mythology, maybe the muck that we're all walking into, I feel like you all have given us so many things to nourish, to treasure, to like really hold on to, especially at this time. So I want to close with a really quick rapid fire. I wonder if you all can name either a story or an infrastructure that we should be treasuring right now, that we should be building right now, that we should be nourishing, that we can either leave the audience with or that you are thinking dearly of holding on to for now and for the future. Whoever wants to jump in can go first, but you got to go quick. So you only have 3 minutes.
I think Nia mentioned the museum, but I think I wanted to just bring it up that, I don't know if people are seeing the many Brazilian, indigenous, Black traditionals that are out there in the world and, I don't know, creating problems for the museum. So I just want to give this heads up that go to a museum, go into this new art disruptive, be close to people in the museum, look at them, exchange some or not. But let's, I think, celebrate. Even when you have those infrastructure, they are changing. So I think let's share these places in other ways and get closer to other people in these maybe old, new, adaptive infrastructures. And thank you again, Maia.
between Nia and Ekene. Who would like to go first? I sense some tension on the call. Ekene, it seems you got the okay, go ahead, Nia. Go ahead. Go for it.
I was really unmuting to say Ekene can go first. But I will come with a boring answer. Infrastructure we should be investing in is Medicaid. A lot of the people on this call, especially folks of color, have loved ones and family members that are on Medicaid, and not only depend on Medicaid, but also depend on infrastructure to make sure that people even know about Medicaid, which has been severely defunded. And so, those infrastructures matter, right? Like you need this group project of a country to work to, because that's what your grandma uses, that's what your cousin uses, that's what you may use. And so I think that's infrastructure we should really be pushing behind, and trying to support. And thank you so much for having me, Maya. This was great.
Ekene, I'm so happy you're closing us out. Go for it.
Oh, well, I'm happy I waited because Nia changed my response, which is now going to be tree infrastructure. I was going to say green spaces, and I was going to say like our forestry and urban forestry infrastructure, but it's really um, the tree infrastructure, having access to that, because also that affects a lot of public health. It intersects with that. They found that areas with low tree canopy had higher rates of COVID-19, and also um, then come to find out that Black neighborhoods have a lot less trees than white neighborhoods. So yeah, I would say our green space infrastructure.
I hope you all have seen all of the hearts and the celebratory pieces that have come through the chat as you all named these beautiful pieces of our shared history, of our shared infrastructure. This was so amazing. Thank the three of you so, so, so much. Lori, Nia, Ekene, we are lucky to have you all doing this amazing work. And I thank you so much for coming together to help share even just a little bit about your practice and how you all approach some of the incredible complexity of this time that we're walking towards. I feel so grateful to have you all here helping lead the way. Thank you so, so, so much. I hope you all get a chance to check out those comments too that are whooping in your favor. So with that said, thank you so much to our audience members for your incredible questions, for your incredible clarity, for your participation today. This recording will be soon up on the Data and Society website, and we look forward to engaging with you again soon. Thank you all so much. We'll see you next time.